It began as a dawn like any other, but by mid-morning the world knew something terrifying had happened. In Tehran, a tightly held council of Iran's military and political leadership made an unprecedented decision, feeling cornered by sustained U.S. and Israeli strikes that had decimated much of its conventional forces and air defenses, and convinced that its very existence was at stake. They ordered the activation of a crude nuclear device. Before alarms could fully sound, a missile carrying that device was launched toward the eastern seaboard of the United States. In Washington, air raid sirens blared. Scrambled jets pursued the unidentified object, and within minutes multiple defense networks were locked onto the incoming threat. Across the Atlantic, the decision in Tehran sent shockwaves through capitals everywhere, as leaders realized that today had crossed every line of modern warfare. The device detonated just off the coast of New Jersey, far enough offshore that the blast did not obliterate the city skyline, yet close enough to create a towering fireball and an electromagnetic pulse that blacked out power grids for miles. In moments, New York, Philadelphia, and hundreds of smaller towns felt the shockwave. Emergency response systems struggled to activate amid the cascading failures of electricity and communications. Thousands were immediately killed, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble as towering waves raced inland. On the streets, survivors stumbled through smoke and dust, unaware of what had just struck them, and the President of the United States addressed the nation from a secure bunker, her voice resolute but grave, declaring that America had been attacked with a weapon of mass destruction. Across the globe, world stock markets plunged and emergency sessions of the United Nations were convened. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, citizens huddled in shelters as the government announced that Iran had simultaneously launched a second nuclear strike aimed across the Mediterranean. Radar blips turned into reality. A second missile was coming. This one, though heading toward Israel, was intercepted by layers of missile defenses, the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Patriot batteries, in an extraordinary display of cooperation between U.S. and Israeli defense forces. The device detonated kilometers above the Mediterranean, preventing a ground blast but showering the region with radiation. Coastal towns bore the brunt, and fishermen radioed desperate calls for help as they watched the horizon light up with an eerie glow. Within hours, NATO's Article 5 was invoked for the first time in history, triggering collective defense commitments. The U.S. launched a counterstrike not at Tehran itself, because Iran's nuclear facilities had long been hardened underground and moved, but at Iranian missile launchers, command centers, and the Revolutionary Guard units deemed responsible for the decision. Cities in the Persian Gulf heard the roar of jets overhead as precision munitions targeted military infrastructure. Meanwhile, Iran's allies in the region, including proxy groups in Iraq and Yemen, began firing barrage after barrage of missiles and drones at U.S. bases throughout the Middle East, escalating a conflict that had already spiraled beyond anyone's control. The humanitarian crisis was immediate and immense. Hospitals in New York City and Tel Aviv overflowed with casualties suffering burns, radiation sickness, and trauma. International aid convoys struggled to organize amid disrupted supply chains. The World Health Organization issued grim forecasts about the spread of radioactive contamination and long-term cancer risks. Border crossings in Canada and Europe saw streams of refugees fleeing panic and instability. Countries in North Africa and the Middle East declared states of emergency as fears of nuclear fallout drifted on unpredictable winds. The Secretariat of the United Nations warned that the conflict threatened civilization itself, with diplomats scrambling to negotiate a ceasefire even as missiles continued to fly. Governments around the world condemned the act. The U.S. Congress and the Israeli Knesset each passed emergency resolutions pledging unwavering retaliation, but also cautioning against all-out nuclear war. Behind closed doors, military planners debated proportionate response, escalation ladders, and how to avoid triggering a global nuclear exchange. Leaders in Europe and China urged restraint and offered to mediate, but mistrust was deep. Russia, historically opposed to U.S. influence in the Middle East, criticized the counterstrikes and warned that nuclear conflict could spur even more nations to pursue atomic weapons, undermining decades-old non-proliferation treaties and driving a new arms race. In Iran, the regime broadcast statements of defiance and fear. Its leadership portrayed the attacks as defensive, a response to what they claimed were existential threats from the West and Israel. Streets in Tehran and Isfahan saw mixed reactions. Parades by hardline supporters, and quiet mourning by families who had lost loved ones in the counterattacks. International journalists described the city's mood as somber, tense, and uncertain whether the next order would be escalation or surrender. Behind the scenes, foreign intelligence reported that elements within Iran's military were fracturing, with some commanders urging immediate ceasefire talks while others pushed for further strikes. Days turned into weeks, and the standoff became a global crisis unlike any before it. Major powers weighed in. China called for immediate de-escalation and offered humanitarian assistance, while Russia flanked that with sharp criticism of U.S. policy. International courts began to consider charges of crimes against humanity. Scientific teams worked around the clock to map radiation plumes and decontaminate affected regions.